blessed us with life and health and all good things. We thank you, Lord, that you have given us the privilege of gathering together as your people to study your word and to worship you this day. Pray that you might sanctify our work and our witness through the Holy Spirit. In Jesus' name. Amen. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So I have 2 classes left. And for the last 2 classes, we're going to look at the Old Testament. The previous 2 classes, we looked at the New Testament, and so now we're going to go to the Old Testament. The name of this class is The History of the Bible, and by that I mean the history of the Bible itself as a book, the history in the Bible, and the history around the Bible. Because in order to understand what's going on in the Bible, the history in the Bible, it's helpful to know something about what's happening in the larger historical context. So that's what I try to do. I try to share that with you as well. So the class is the history of the Bible. We've gone through the history of the Bible as a book. We've looked at the history in the New Testament. And now we're going to look at the history in the Old Testament. Now, I did make some handouts, and I don't know if you have them or not. This one is the history of the Bible, Silverdale Lutheran Church. And what I did when I originally developed this class many years ago, I found a book that inspired me to divide biblical history into epics. So I've modified what I found in this book. So what you have here, if you have it in front of you, and that is epics. I think I have 11 epics. Yeah, there are 11 epics. So for example, we looked at the history of history in the New Testament, and that would have been Epic 8, 9, 10, 11. Epic 8, the life and ministry of Jesus, from the birth of Christ to the year 30. Epic 9, the birth of the church, 30 to 45. The life and ministry of Paul, 45 to 70, and then the growth of the church, 70 to 100, or the end of the first century. So we've looked at all those epics. So now if you go over and look at the first sheet, epics 1 through 7, and so I've divided up Old Testament history into 7 different epics. So, and I've also, if you'll notice, I've also divided up the books in the Old Testament so that you have also the historical books listed within each one of those epics, so you can kind of follow along. So it's a nice resource if you have it. All right. So let's talk about the Old Testament. Why do we call it old? Well, it is. Historically, it's very old. But it comes from a passage in the book of Hebrews, where the author, the unknown author of the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, he talked about a new covenant. So you can think, he said there's an old covenant and there's a new covenant. In other words, God dealt with his people in the Old Testament in this way, but now he's dealing with us in a new way, this new covenant. So we've customarily called the Old Testament, the Older Testament, and the New Testament being the New Testament of Christ. You can use the word testament or covenant because covenants play a huge and important role throughout the Bible. And in particular, in the Old Testament, we're going to talk about 2 very important covenants here in a minute. So we call it the Old Covenant or the Old Testament. Why would we call it testament? In fact, Martin Luther preferred the term testament. Where do we get that word from?
Testify.
Yeah, to testify, and also a last will and testament. So when you go to Holy Communion, Martin Luther liked to say that when you go to Holy Communion, your pastor is not functioning like a priest in the Old Testament where they would offer sacrifices on your behalf, but rather Martin Luther said that the pastor functioned more like an attorney who was reading the last will and testament of Jesus to you. And so when you hear the words of institution, that's the last will and testament of Jesus. And who are the beneficiaries of Jesus' last will and testament?
Us.
We are. That's right. So Old Testament and New Testament. I like the terms Old Testament and New for that very reason, because even in the Old Testament, you have God showering gifts upon his people. The central message of the Bible is God's grace and mercy and love, shown to his people in the Old Testament and shown to us now in the New Testament as well. All right, so let's turn to the Old Testament. So in terms of the history of the Old Testament, when does the history begin in the Old Testament?
In the beginning.
In the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the Old Testament begins with the creation of the world. So when did that happen? Well, the Bible doesn't say, nor is it particularly relevant to the story of the Bible. In fact, when you read through the Old Testament, you will see that the Bible does not argue for God's existence. The Bible simply assumes God's existence and just proclaims and tells us that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So you have these first 11 majestic chapters in the book of Genesis that describe the creation of humanity, the fall of humanity, and everything leading up to the call of Abraham. So last Sunday I said that you could graph out biblical history in this way. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, line straight up. After the fall, the rebellion of Adam and Eve, what happens?
Down.
Yes, there's a steady descent into sin and chaos and injustice, to the point where it gets so bad that God says, I think I need to hit the reset button. And I need to cleanse the world of sin. And so how does he do so?
No.
He does so through a flood. So the flood should remind you of the waters of baptism, because that's what baptism does. It washes away your sin, and that is what God did. He washed away sin from the world through the flood. But God had a problem, and that was there was one righteous family. And who was that?
Noah.
It was Noah. So could God also wipe out Noah's family? No, it would have been unjust for God to do so. So God saved Noah by telling him to build an ark, and so God preserved Noah because he was righteous, he was a faithful believer. He preserved him through the flood, but what was the problem? He was both, as Luther would say, simultaneously sinner and saint, wasn't he? So the seed of sin was also carried in Noah through the flood, so that after the flood, humanity was still, they were still sinners. So what happened right after the flood and after Noah established himself, Noah and his family, what happened after that? Sin began to manifest itself immediately in Noah's family and then throughout humanity after that. So if you read through those chapters in Genesis, that's what you see. So God says, well, all right, I need to get rid of sin. So this time I'm not going to do it from the outside in, right? Rather, I'm going to do it from the inside out. So God gives humanity permission to establish government, to hold sin in check. That's what you have in the story of the covenant of Noah. God made an agreement with humanity, a covenant agreement, and said, you now have permission to use the power of the sword. In other words, to enforce law. Even capital punishment is now given to humanity so that you can establish government to hold sin in check. So that's why we have government. Then you have the story of the Tower of Babel. What does God do? God distributes humanity all over the world, and he does so in order that humanity can't come together like they were trying to do in the Tower of Babel to storm the gates of heaven. So as Lord Acton said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and so God distributes sinful humanity over the world and divides us. So you have creation, and then descent into sin, and then you have the flood, right? And then now you have a gradual descent all the way down to the end of human history, which is described in the book of Revelation. That's right. So what did God do? He bent that thing so that it would be not as steep a slope, right? Because God wanted us to have, he wanted to have enough time in order that he might save us through, and you can write a cross right there, through Christ. So the new way in which God has decided to cleanse the world of sin is through the cross. So as Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 31, a new covenant has been established by God in order that we might be cleansed from the inside out rather than the outside in. So that's really the story of the Bible, and also the story of the first 11 chapters. All right, so how does the story of redemption begin? Who does it begin with? In Genesis chapter 12. It begins with a fellow named Abraham. So one day, God appeared to Abraham and said, "Abraham, I choose you." And Abraham probably said, "Well, God, what do you choose me for?" And God also says, "Abraham, I'm choosing you not because you're such a great person or anything about you. I just decided to choose you. It's a manifestation of God's grace. And I choose you to be the father of a great nation and father of great people who will become a great nation, and then eventually all nations will be blessed through you." So that is the threefold promise that God made to Abraham, the most important covenant that you will find in the Bible. In fact, that covenant, that promise that God made to Abraham was eventually fulfilled in Jesus. The first two parts of the covenant were fulfilled by God in the Old Testament, and the third part was fulfilled in the New Testament. So the story of the Old Testament is simply God fulfilling the first two promises that he made to Abraham. That Abraham would become the father of a great people, and that great people would become a great nation. And then eventually, all nations will be blessed through Christ Jesus. All right, so what year did Abraham live? Around 2000 BC. I'm rounding it down. So in around 2000 BC. So 2,000 years before the time of Christ. So in terms of history, if you look at the New Testament, we're only dealing with a century, but in the Old Testament, we're dealing with how long a period? 2,000 years. Amazing. So in 2000 BC, Abraham receives the call from God. Well, what was going on in the world at that point? Where was Abraham's family originally from? They were originally from Ur. So in 2000 BC, there were two great empires. There was an empire in Egypt, and then an empire in Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates River, what we would call Iraq in that area. So there were two great empires, one in Egypt and then one in Mesopotamia. It didn't become Babylon as a great empire that we know of later, but that's where you had civilizations begin in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. So in 2000 BC, along the Tigris and Euphrates River, you had many cities and small towns. And each one of those towns was independent of the other. And so eventually, civil war broke out amongst those towns and cities. And refugees began to, in around 2000 BC, began to migrate north along the Euphrates River up into what we would call Syria and eventually into the Promised Land. One of those families that fled the conflict that was going on in that Babylonian region was the family of Abraham. So Abraham's family traveled from Ur up to Haran, and that is where Abraham received his call. So in around 2000 BC, God calls Abraham and says, "I want you to leave your family and go to a place where I am calling you to go." And this will eventually become the Promised Land. And where is that?
Israel.
Yeah, Israel, the Holy Land. Now, I wish I had a map here to kind of show you the geography of the Middle East. But so you have, let's see, I'm going to do it in reverse here. Okay, this would be Egypt over here, and this would be Mesopotamia over here. So let's see. Okay. So if you just visualize in your mind, so if you're in the Middle East, there are two great rivers that run north and west, and they are the Tigris and Euphrates. So you could travel up those rivers, and then you have a short jump across to the Mediterranean Sea, right? And then you can travel south, and eventually you can end up in Egypt. So if you have a great civilization in Egypt, and you have a great civilization in Babylon, and if you were to travel from one to the other, that is how you would do so. So commerce would travel along that particular route, up the Euphrates, across to the Mediterranean, and then down into Egypt. So if you think about it geographically, what's the most important area to control?
The Mediterranean.
Yeah, that Mediterranean area, the Holy Land. So if you have 18-wheelers, right, camels, traveling up the Euphrates and then down through the coast there along the Mediterranean Sea to Egypt, they could also offload cargo in those cities along the coast of the Mediterranean because ships would come in, right? And so they could take, goods and commerce either into Egypt or up and around. So both Egypt and the Babylonian region, those two great civilizations, they vied for control of the Holy Land. That's right. So the Holy Land was exceedingly important. Why were David and Solomon in particular, why was he such a powerful king during his era? Well, there are many reasons, but one reason was that the Egyptian Empire and the Babylonian Empire were not very strong at that time. And in fact, Solomon was one of the strongest kings in the whole Middle East at that time. So you can think of the wars and conflicts that occurred during Israel's history in terms of the history of those two great civilizations. When they were strong, they would vie over Israel was weak. When they were weak, Israel would be strong. All right, so Abraham travels to the Holy Land, and so the rest of the book of Genesis describes the story of Abraham and Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So the patriarchal period in the book of Genesis covers about 200 years, from around 2000 BC until 1800 BC. So if you read through the book of Genesis, it's simply the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And the predominant theme in Genesis is simply this. God has made this promise to Abraham, and then there are conflicts and difficulties. The promise seems to be in jeopardy. Abraham's life is in jeopardy, or Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. In fact, Joseph ends up in Egypt, doesn't he? He's a slave in Egypt. So how is God going to fulfill his promise to Abraham if now Joseph is in Egypt? So the story of the book of Genesis is simply how God guided and protected the patriarchs in order that he might fulfill the promise that they might become a great and powerful people. So at the end of the book of Genesis, you have Joseph and his family, and where are they?
In Egypt.
They are in Egypt. All right, so the first part of the promise, that Abraham's family would become great and populous, a huge people, chosen people by God. So in the book of Genesis, that's where it ends. So the book of Exodus begins, and so where are the people of God?
Still in Egypt.
They're in Egypt. So for 400 years, the people toil as slaves in Egypt, don't they? Here's a question for you. So they were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt during that particular period of time. Did they build the pyramids? Probably not. The pyramids were probably built several centuries before the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. It could be that they did work on or build some of the last pyramids to be built, but probably not. So, but they were slaves in Egypt. The Pharaoh was powerful, and he loved having slaves. But here the problem is that God made a promise to Abraham, and that is the second part of the promise is that they would become what?
A great nation.
A great nation. So how is God going to fulfill the second part of the promise? Well, the story of Exodus is the story of how God fulfills that second aspect of the promise. So the year is 1400 BC. 1440 specifically, and a man named Moses is on Mount Sinai, and he's tending some sheep. And who appears to him? God does, in a burning bush. And again, God says, Moses, I choose you. Not because you're such a great person, not because you are worthy to be my servant, but simply because I've decided to choose you. And what does God say to Moses? He says, well, I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want you to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. So how does Moses react to this? He brings up every possible excuse. He says, there's no way. First of all, who are you? And God gives his name. And what does God say? He says, well, I am who I am, or you can also translate it, I will be who I will be. And that's all you need to know. I am who I am. And so at first Moses does not want to obey this call from God, but God gets exasperated with Moses and says, you're going to do it. So you are. And at the end, Moses, in fact, at one point Moses says, well, I'm not a good public speaker. Someone needs to speak. And God, in exasperation, he says, all right, your brother Aaron is going to help you. And so finally, Moses decides, yes, he's going to obey God and go back to Egypt. So here we have Moses, and he's going back to Egypt, and he's going to confront Pharaoh, one of the most powerful political figures in the world at that time. And he's going to walk in and tell him, let my people go, they're slaves. How does Pharaoh react? Well, he says, who are you and why should I care? Of course I'm not going to do that. It's free labor, there's no way I'm going to let them go. And Moses said, well, God is with me, and if you do not do so, terrible plagues are going to come upon your country. And so how many plagues did come upon the country?
7.
Yeah, 10 plagues. 10 plagues in all. It took a while for Pharaoh finally to get a clue here that indeed this was God's people, and he needed to free them, and eventually he did. So the last plague was a terrible plague in which the Israelites were protected by God. How were they protected? Yeah, blood on the doorpost of the first Passover meal, right? Lamb. Right? And so after that last and terrible plague, Pharaoh lets them free, and off they go. It didn't take long for Pharaoh to change his mind, though. And he sent an army after the Israelites, and they end up at the Red Sea, and things do not go well for Pharaoh's army. And God delivers his people yet again. So what you find in the story of God's people in Genesis and Exodus in particular, and that is the promise is going to be fulfilled by God, but it's kind of an adventure story because you have all these ways in which the promise is jeopardized by evil and misfortune and even disobedience on the part of God's people. 50 days after leaving Egypt, Moses leads God's people to Mount Sinai. That's right. So God descends upon the mountain, and Moses goes up, and what does he receive? He receives the 10 Commandments. Why did God give the 10 Commandments to the Israelites? One way of looking at the 10 Commandments is to think of them as the constitution of the new emerging nation. Just as we have a constitution, so now the 10 Commandments functions as the constitution for the nation of Israel. So in the rest of the book of Exodus, God also gives, decrees, many laws. I like to call it the Code of Federal Regulations. In other words, it's the law based upon the Constitution that God had just given them. So what was God doing? God was creating and organizing this new nation. What does a nation need? It needs a constitution, it needs laws, it also needs a leader, and that was Moses. I remember when I was in college, I studied political science, and they said there are two things that a leader needs: authority and legitimacy. Some leaders have authority but no legitimacy. Some leaders have legitimacy but no authority. So for Moses, did he have authority and legitimacy in the beginning? He had legitimacy because God had appointed him to be the leader, but it took a while for his authority, in other words, the power to exercise the position that he had. It took about 40 years, actually, the wilderness wandering. So that's what you have in the book of Exodus. You have the establishment of this nation. So God has now fulfilled, at least in part, the second part of the promise. And that was that this great and chosen people, the descendants of Abraham, have now become a nation under the leadership of Moses. One of the things that you should keep in mind, and that is that Moses actually held 3 offices at the same time. He was a prophet, because God spoke to the people through him. He was a priest, because he would intercede on their behalf. And he was king as well. He is the only person in the Old Testament that would hold all 3 positions at the same time. The only other person that would hold all 3 positions at the same time would be Christ himself in the New Testament. So the book of Exodus ends with the people of God. They're at Mount Sinai. They have received their constitution and the basic laws to organize this nation. And so what's the next historical book in the Old Testament? It's the book of Numbers. So you have Exodus, you have Genesis, Exodus. Leviticus is not really a history book. It's a book of further rules and regulations, in particular liturgical and worship rules and regulations. I like to call it the Manual on the Liturgy. Pastor Bill has a copy of that. So it organized the sacrificial system, how you ordain priests and so forth. So that's basically what you have in the book of Leviticus. So you have Genesis and Exodus, 2 great historical books. You have Leviticus, which is a book of laws, rules, and regulations that organize and structure the worship life of the people of God in Israel. So in the book of Exodus, you have the temple kind of outlined, and then now you have worship beginning. All right. So after about a year at Mount Sinai, now the people of God are ready to make the journey to the Promised Land under the leadership of Moses. The year is 1440 BC. So think about the people of God as they journey to the Promised Land. They're a nation, they're an emerging nation, but they're also a military force. They're like an army. So if you read carefully through the book of Numbers, you will see that they are carefully structured in terms of who they are and where the various tribes will march and so forth. So they had to be not just an emerging nation, but they were also an army that was marching to the Promised Land. So when you read through Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and you will find some very stringent rules, laws, and regulations, many of which require the death penalty, which we would never impose today. So why did God impose those at that time? Well, I like to think of it much like, for those of you who've been in the military, you live under very, very strict rules. Very strict rules. So God established some very strict rules in order to preserve the integrity and the very existence of God's people as they traveled through the wilderness for those 40 years. So many of those laws, rules, and regulations don't apply to us because they're historically based. They're based upon the particular situation and circumstances of God's people as they traveled through the wilderness to the Promised Land. Does that make sense? You also have 3 different kinds of rules or laws in the Old Testament. You have moral laws or rules. You also have ceremonial laws and rules for worship and so forth, but you also have public health laws and rules. So imagine, here you have this group of people, they're out in the Sinai Peninsula, they're traveling together, and it's before modern science and medicine, So many of the laws and rules about quarantining people who are bleeding, for example, many of the laws and rules. In fact, many of what we now know as kosher laws, what you can eat and not eat, a lot of it is very strict. Why? Because God wanted to preserve the life and integrity of the people as they're traveling through the wilderness. Many of those laws and rules don't apply to us, don't have to, but for them it was very important. You didn't want contagion or disease or virus to break out, so they were very strict in terms of how they lived together as God's people. Does that help you understand what seem to be many of the strange laws, rules, and regulations that you have in the Old Testament? Just think, you have this people all together. They're traveling together through hostile territory, and in order for them to survive, they needed to function much like a military force. Furthermore, they had to survive in terms of making sure that they didn't die not only of starvation, but also of disease as well. So that might help you understand why God gave many of the stringent laws and rules that you have in the Old Testament.
What was the estimate of the population that left Egypt?
Well, a good question. Bible scholars wonder just how large this group is. Traditionally, they thought it was 500,000, maybe even more than that. So we don't know exactly how large it was. But it was a very large group of people. So here they are, they're migrant, yes?
What is the wilderness?
Yeah, the wilderness would be basically the Sinai Peninsula. So if you look on a map, you will see that you have Egypt here, the Sinai Peninsula here, and then the Holy Land. So they traveled from Mount Sinai, kind of in the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula, and then they traveled up to the Holy Land. How long did it take them to get there? So they leave. After a year, they're at Mount Sinai, and then God says, time to go. And so off they go. How long does it take them to get to the Holy Land?
You said 40 years.
Did it take 40 years to get there?
It doesn't seem right.
It did not. It only took about, well, maybe a week at most. So in the book of Numbers, you have, incidentally, why do they call it Numbers?
Because it was a census.
Yeah, there's a census at the beginning of the book, and there's a census at the end of the book. Why are census so important? Well, you want to know who's on the journey. And so as an organized, nation or, in this case, a military force, they had to know who was there. And they also needed to organize themselves in terms of tribes and so forth. So it only took them, a few days, maybe a week or so to get from Mount Sinai to the Holy Land. So they arrive and they send spies into the land of Canaan. And what did they discover?
Giants.
Yes, when they arrive, they discover that there is a strong and vibrant civilization flourishing in the Holy Land. They were Canaanites, probably cousins in many ways. Remember I mentioned the migration of refugees up the Tigris and into the Holy Land? They were probably part of that refugee group many centuries before. So here we have the Canaanites living in the Holy Land. What was their civilization like? It was powerful, it was sophisticated, and it was wealthy because they controlled the most important territory in the Middle East. So they were powerful, sophisticated, cosmopolitan. They had powerful cities, very important cities, the Canaanites did. What else do we know about the Canaanites?
They were bad.
They were ruthless and brutal, and their worship was just terrible. They had no problem with a child sacrifice, a human sacrifice. So it was, in some way, it was a lot like the Aztecs. I don't know if you know anything about the Aztecs. Yeah, it was kind of like the Aztecs. It was terrible. So when the Israelites arrive, they are intimidated. They are scared. There's no possible way that we could conquer the Canaanites. There's no way. And so they refuse to go in. And so God says to them, all right, you're not ready. So you're going to wander around in the Sinai Peninsula for the next 38 years until you are ready. And that is what happened. So for 38 years, the Israelites just wandered around. And during that time, they grew and they matured, both spiritually as well as physically as a nation. They began to coalesce. One of the things you will see, and that is that even though through that 38-year period, they were continually challenging Moses' authority, and they were challenging God's authority because Moses had been appointed by God. Eventually they coalesced and began to trust Moses and trust God, but it took 38 years to do so. So they had to grow and mature. So over that 38-year period, in fact, there was at one point, they finally said, we've had enough of this, we're heading back to Egypt. And so off they go, and what happens? They are bitten by snakes and they begin to die. And so Moses intercedes for them, and God says, all right, get a pole and put a bronze snake on the pole and tell the people that if they simply gaze on that bronze snake, they shall be healed. And lo and behold, that is what happened. Jesus, when he was talking to Nicodemus in John chapter 3, he said, in the very same way, the Son of Man will be what? Lifted up on a pole, so that all those who focus their hearts and minds, in other words, trust in the one on this cross, shall be saved in the very same way. Isn't it interesting that Jesus would use that story from the wilderness wanderings to describe who he is for us? Yeah.
But isn't it weird that, that God would have them look at a bronze? I mean, where God didn't want us worshiping, idols, but,
Yeah, that's right.
bronze
There's a strict-
statues and.
Yeah, that's right. There's a strict prohibition. It's not so much worshiping, in this case, in the Old Testament, it's not so much worshiping the bronze snake, but it is interesting that it's a bronze snake on a pole.
Yeah.
So, why bronze? Well, they didn't have gold and they didn't have silver, right? They had bronze, so that's what they had. And it was the Bronze Age anyway, historically, yeah.
Were they separated into tribes in Egypt, or did that happen in Sinai?
That happened in Sinai. So you will find, as you read through Exodus and Numbers, you will find that they organized themselves in terms of tribe. And in fact, as they marched, and it was basically a march, they had a tabernacle, which was a portable worship site that they would set up and then take down, where when they'd stop, they would build it up, and then when they stopped somewhere, or when they moved, they would take it down, and they would march, and they had strict areas where each one of the tribes were to be as they would march ahead. So it was in many ways both a nation and a military force as they moved through the Sinai Peninsula. It simply took a while. It took 38 years for them to finally coalesce and begin to come together as a functioning nation. They had a constitution, they had laws, they had a leader, and they began to basically become a kind of fighting force so that they would be ready to enter into the Promised Land. Well, eventually, after 38 years, they end up back at the Holy Land, east of the Jordan River, and Moses is ready to enter into the Promised Land, and yet God says to him what? He says, "You cannot go." And it's kind of mysterious, but God says, because of your own disobedience, you will not be able to enter into the Promised Land. And Bible scholars are not exactly sure exactly what Moses did. You can kind of go into the story of Numbers, and there are times when Moses got frustrated with God. And it could be that, God just said, Moses, you're not the one to lead the people into the Promised Land. So at the very end of the book of Numbers, there we have the people of God right there, poised to enter into the Promised Land. Moses is not going to go in with them, so Moses appoints a successor. And who is that?
Joshua?
It is Joshua, one of the greatest military leaders in history. Many years ago, I watched on PBS, called The History of War by Caleb Carr. And Caleb Carr went to the Holy Land, and he interviewed a professor that taught at the War College in Israel. And that professor said, we still study Joshua and the great battles that he led in the book of Joshua as they conquered the Promised Land. They considered him one of the greatest generals in the history of Israel. So just before the people of God enter into the Promised Land, Moses preaches a series of sermons, valedictory sermons, kind of farewell sermons to the people, and that they are found in the book of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is basically the farewell sermon or sermons of Moses to his people after 40 years. What does Moses say to the people? Well, first of all, he just chronicles everything that's happened. And he says, in spite of your sin, your disobedience, you have a good and gracious God who forgives you, and in spite of your sin has led you and guided you to the Holy Land. So, Moses says, you have a decision to make. Will you choose to obey or not? Will you obey God or not? Choose life, and if you do so, you will flourish as a nation in the Holy Land. And the response of the people is, indeed we will. In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses even reminds them of the Ten Commandments. So you have the Ten Commandments in Exodus, and you have another version of the Ten Commandments, basically the same, in the book of Deuteronomy. So Moses chronicles everything that has happened. He reminds them that they are God's people, established by God, and he says, choose life. In other words, choose obedience to God. Be faithful to God, obey God, and if you do so, you will flourish as a nation in the land that God has given you. And that's how the book of Deuteronomy ends. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, those are the foundational books for the people of God in Israel. They're the foundational books of the Old Testament. So when you think about the Old Testament, think of it like a layer cake. The foundational documents are those first 5 books. They're called the Law. And then the next group of books are the historical books, beginning with Joshua all the way through Esther. Those books chronicle the history of God's people in the Promised Land. Then the next group are the prophets, who comment on just how well the Israelites were doing in heeding the call of Moses to obey God and be faithful to his word. And then finally, the last part would be the devotional books, like the Psalms, Proverbs, and so forth, the wisdom literature. So the most important part of the Old Testament are those first 5 books that we've just talked about. Then you have the historical books, the prophets, and then the wisdom literature. Okay. All right, we have a few more minutes. Let me just talk a little bit about Joshua. All right, so the next book is Joshua. So Joshua, the great general, he leads them into the Promised Land by crossing over the Jordan River. So if you read through the book of Joshua, you will see that this God's people cross over the Jordan River, and they do so almost like a processional in a liturgy. They cross over in a very organized way. In fact, they even build an altar right in the middle of the Jordan River. So they cross over. They cross over, and into the Promised Land they go. So the book of Joshua can be divided into 3 sections, 3 great military campaigns. So Joshua leads God's people as they conquer the central region of Israel. Then they go south and they conquer the southern region of Israel. And then they conquer the northern region of what would become Israel. So 3 great military campaigns are found in the book of Joshua. The central region, south, and the north. So the command, however, was that when they go in, they completely subdue and completely conquer all of Canaan. And did they do that?
No.
They did not. They decided that it was too hard, too difficult to do so, to drive out the Canaanites or to subdue them completely. And so they decided that they are going to coexist with the Canaanites in the Promised Land. So you had Israelites, Jews, and Canaanites living side by side in the Holy Land. After they had conquered all of the Holy Land, it is divided up into 12 regions for the 12 tribes. So at the end of the book of Joshua, you have the people of God. They have now established themselves in the Holy Land. They've divided up the region into 12 tribes. But the problem is that the Canaanites are still living there. And God said, because you believe that you can coexist with the Canaanites, that's going to be a problem for you, because you will be tempted to adopt their ways and worship their gods and live as they do. And that was the critical error that the Israelites made according to the book of Joshua. So Joshua finally dies, and then what happens? Well, the nations decide that they're going to live as a confederation of 12 tribes, rather than have coalesce as one nation. How well did it go for them? Well, that's the story that we will look at in the book of Judges next Sunday. So, descendants of the Canaanites. Well, the Palestinians actually do identify themselves as the Canaanites for good reason, because they say, hey, the Canaanites were there and the Israels drove us out. This was our land originally. So, and now they would not adopt or endorse the religious practices of the Canaanites, but they did. They do. So, isn't it amazing that the very struggle that occurred back 1,400 years before the time of Christ is continuing to this day?
Wow.
Questions or comments?
You mentioned with the story of Noah, and God giving him capital punishment rights.
Yes.
What-
Yeah, through the covenant of Noah to the humanity, yes.
and How did, that's been a topic even to today about whether capital punishment's justified or not.
Yeah, from a biblical perspective, God gave us permission to use capital punishment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to use it. So, but in other words, God said you can take a life to save a life. That's basically what the law was. God says you can take a life in order to save a life. All life comes from God. God is the one who gives life and takes life, but he says you can do so in order to protect the innocent. So the whole concept of justice and order in the world was given to humanity through the covenant of Noah. So we have been given permission to take life in order to save life. And in fact, that happens in many and various ways, doesn't it? I like to say that we can all sit here in the comfort of this room in safety and security because there are certain individuals driving around here with weapons. Who are they?
Law enforcement.
Law enforcement, that's right. That's a manifestation of the covenant of Noah. So it doesn't mean that they're going to, use that lethal force, but they do so as a deterrent against sin and evil, right, to keep order. Same thing with the military. It isn't that we have to use it, but we can do so when necessary to preserve innocent life. So, yeah, questions or comments? All right, thank you, and we'll see you next Sunday.